I think a challenge for a lot of Catholics is just understanding what evangelization is, or if even evangelization is a Catholic thing.
For sure.
That evangelization often sounds like something that other Christians do.
That's right.
So explain that for us.
Yeah, well, it's a good question because many people are confused about evangelization. I think because of that, that's hurt the evangelical thrust of the church. We can look at it in a few different ways. The first is historically. The church has always been evangelical in her mission. From the time of St. Paul and the apostles who spread out to the corners of the earth to bring the gospel, we see the conversion of Europe and of the Roman Empire. We see, in the 16th century, the Jesuits and other missionaries coming over to North America and bringing the gospel. We see, the great saints like Francis Xavier going off to India and to Japan, and on his way to China to bring the good news. So the church is full of Catholics that have dedicated themselves to evangelization. And the faith we have today is because other people before us, generations before us, have had that missionary mentality. But for all sorts of philosophical and sociological reasons, the church in some sense, or at least individual members of the church, have lost that missionary mentality that we've carried for so many generations. And so people looking at it today may say, well, is evangelization really a Catholic thing? And the truth is, absolutely. There's nothing more Catholic than evangelization. We have the richest tradition of evangelization. And in the last 35 years or so, the church has really begun to recapture that evangelical mission. It began in Vatican II with the document Ad Gentes, but I really pin it to Pope Paul VI's document, Evangelii Nunciandi, which he wrote in the mid-70s. In English, it's just on the announcing of the gospel, which gives you an insight into what he's trying to communicate. And what he says is that there's a couple of really key lines. The first is he says the church exists to evangelize. That's why she exists. People think the church exists for all sorts of other reasons, and maybe a few people should evangelize, but most don't. But he says the very existence of the church is for the sake of bringing the gospel. And that makes sense, because the church is there to continue to bring the gospel, the truth of Christ, to the next generation. He says that the church, by her very nature, is missionary. And so when we see the church as not being involved in evangelization, we're missing an absolutely essential component of what the church is.
So what's so new about the new
question.
evangelization?
We hear the term new evangelization all the time, and people wonder, well, what does it mean? Well, John Paul II coined the term in 1981. And I think what he was doing was he was reflecting on the pastoral situation of the church in the universal church in the world. And traditionally, evangelization and mission work has always been seen as going from Christian areas to non-Christian areas. So we think of, the great, evangelical work that was being done in Africa or in Asia and by the Jesuits here and even in North America. It was always a movement from the church going outward.
Yeah.
But as you know, there's been the church herself has faced tremendous difficulties in the last several decades. And so John Paul II began to look at the church herself and realize that the church needs to be re-evangelized. If we look at all people that have been baptized Catholic, there's many, many Catholics that themselves are no longer attending Mass. No longer, what he says is no longer have a living sense of the faith. So they may carry the name Catholic, they may be baptized, but for all intents and purposes, they're no longer living out a relationship with God in their lives. And so they need to be evangelized. So this new evangelization is directed inward towards the church as opposed to outward, outside of the church.
So, okay, so that makes sense. That describes the newness. So let's say, okay, so what the Holy Father's calling for is that we need to, evangelize in our own backyard.
Yes.
Okay. So, but he's obviously talking about people that, that have been baptized, that have received the sacraments. Mm-hmm. They might be praying. They're going to church. So what does evangelization mean if I've basically received the sacraments already,
Right.
and I'm going to church more or less? What does evangelization mean in that situation?
Yeah, I think evangelization is really leading a person to a deep encounter with Christ, where they are living under his lordship. In the church, I mean, if we just look at, for example, mass attendance rates, which isn't the only metric to use, but in Europe, many countries, under 15% of baptized Catholics are now attending Mass. Canada's slightly higher, but really it's about 1 in 5. So first of all, we have 80% of the baptized who, just as a minimum, aren't even going to Mass. So there's a huge area for evangelization in reintroducing them to the faith and leading them there. But even among the baptized and those that practice the faith, we still encounter many people in our parishes, in our communities, who maybe go to Mass out of duty, out of obligation, for social reasons. Maybe they just kind of enjoy going to Mass. They enjoy, they see their friends and they like the music. But they're not there because they're in a deeply committed love relationship with God. Yeah. And so evangelization really is reintroducing them to the person of Christ and letting them know that Christ wants to have a deep relationship with them. And I think one of the keys for that is that it's important that we make a decision. It's easy to kind of go through our whole lives and just sort of be there as a casual, passive observer. But I think God's plan for us is something much richer, and that is that we are an active participant in our faith. That it isn't just about doing the right thing and making sure that we go to Mass on weekends. Of course, we should do that. But it's about developing a relationship with a God who loves us and who we love. And so evangelization is leading people into this encounter with God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that their heart is transformed, and no longer is their faith a dry morality or a duty or an obligation, but it is something that's being driven out of love for God and a desire to deepen their relationship with Him. One of the real challenges for the new evangelization is that we need to have people trained to do it. And what I've encountered in the last number of years is there's a lot of Catholics who really love the Lord, they're evangelized themselves, they want to be able to share the gospel, but they don't know where to begin. They've never been given formation and training in what to do. So when they think of evangelization, it's intimidating, it's scary, it seems like something beyond them. They've never really been equipped to do it. It's a little bit like, if I told you, Chris, you need to be a farmer tomorrow. But you're like, okay, but you have no idea when to plant a seed, how to work the soil, when to harvest, when to fertilize, where to store things. You're open to it, but you've never been shown how to do it. And in all areas of the Christian life, it's important for us to be discipled. And part of an integral formation of a disciple is forming them for that essential mission of being an evangelist.
So often people feel, really intimidated because
Sure.
they feel that they're, first of all, they're not worthy.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know their faith well enough. They're not I'm not a theologian. I don't know
Sure.
my faith inside out and backwards.
Yeah.
Could you address some of those concerns
For sure.
people have?
The truth about evangelization is that it's not nearly as scary or complicated as people think. Often we're intimidated because we don't have any experience doing it. We're intimidated because we haven't seen other people doing it, and we're not really sure where to begin. But another difficulty is that we have these distorted notions of evangelization, as if, to live out my Christian call, I have to be standing on a street corner or something like that. Now, maybe that's what God's calling some people to. But for most Christians, what He's calling them to do is evangelize in the everyday context of their life, where they have relationships with others, whether it be at work, in their families, in their neighborhoods, in their parishes. And it's not, as the world says, it's not preaching in the sense of trying to force others. John Paul II said evangelization is an invitation. We invite others to encounter Christ as we've encountered Him. And really what we have to do is move away from the idea that evangelization is forcing anything on anyone, but rather it's an invitation to something wonderful. It's a gift that God, the gift of faith that we've been given, we're simply passing on that gift to others. Just as we love to share all good news. My friend just called me recently, and he just got a new job. I hadn't heard from him in 6 months. Why did he call me up? Because he had good news he wanted to share. Well, the greatest news is the news that Christ has won salvation for us. And so the more we come to understand that and appropriate and appreciate that in our life, the more we're going to want to share it with others. So I think the very first step to be effective in evangelization is understanding what evangelization is and seeing it in that context. It really is an act of charity, because knowing and loving Christ brings tremendous joy to us. It opens up the gate of salvation to us. And so sharing that with other people gives them the opportunity to encounter God the way that we've encountered him.
So what's a, in the course that you give, what might be a practical skill or insight that you give to people that they can bring with them when they're, they're at the water cooler, they're at the mall, they're at the family reunion.
Right.
What's something practical that we can empower people to do in those settings?
Well, what we do is we do retreats and workshops. We run these schools of evangelization, which is what you're referring to. And they're 3.5-day programs where we really take people and give them an in-depth crash course in evangelization. And we start up with the theory way up here of the theology and the spirituality. And each day we work our way down to the very practical nuts and bolts of it. So just a couple things that we cover. The first is how to share a testimony. Christ has touched us, and what we need to do is be able to communicate what God has done in our life to others. When I was I'm recently married, and I would go around telling people how wonderful marriage is, how much I love my wife, because I can't help but tell people how great it is. Sharing a testimony is the same thing. It's sharing what God has done in our life. So we equip people to share testimonies in a way that can inspire and touch others and help them to realize that God wants something really wonderful for them as well. We also look at what is the message we're trying to communicate. I mean, it seems simple. We talk about sharing the gospel, but most people have difficulty articulating in a very clear and concise way what is the gospel. And so helping people to say, there's a lot in the Christian faith. The Catholic faith is so rich and deep. But we need to distill it down to the essentials. So we can share that with people. People don't need to know, every single thing that the Council of Trent taught the first time we meet them. What they need to know is that we're separated from God. And yet God, in his infinite, merciful love, chose to send his Son to die for us. Jesus Christ came, took on flesh, gave his life for us to reconcile us to the Father. And that there is an invitation from God for us to receive that gift. And if we will participate in the sacraments, and if we'll open our heart to him, then he will fill us with his love and his grace. So just knowing what the gospel is and how to share it. We give them a very effective tool called the Ultimate Relationship. It's a little booklet, and we just show people how to use that in sharing with other people, so that if they're a little bit nervous and they're not sure that they're going to hit on all the main points of the gospel, they have a very concrete tool that they can share with others. And at the end of it, there's a very simple prayer inviting people to surrender their heart in a new way to God. So those are some of the real practical tools that we give people to equip them to be active in evangelization.
Very good. So let me describe a difficult situation.
Sure.
Right? You run into a friend that you haven't seen in years. Maybe since you yourself have been evangelized.
Yes.
Right? How do you share the gospel with that person?
Sure. Well, that's a very common, because we all have people in our life that float in and out of our circles, and we encounter them again, and we'd like to bring them deeper into the faith. One of the first keys to evangelization is developing a relationship with people. Pope Paul VI talked about a cycle of evangelization, and the very first step is witness, that the person sees a Christian life lived out. And in order for them to see that witness, they need to be in a relationship with us, so they can see the joy and the difference that living a fervent Christian life makes. But the interesting thing is, then Pope Paul VI said, we have to proclaim the gospel. So in the situation you presented about an old friend, what I would do is I would really try to deepen my relationship with them. I would make time for them. I would hang out with them. I'd get their contact information. And I would pray fervently for the Holy Spirit to open up the door. And once we've sort of reestablished with each other and we've caught up on, old friends and jobs and travel and all that other stuff, once we've, kind of developed a relationship of trust and respect with each other, then I would begin to share either my testimony with them, or I would begin to ask him questions about what's going on deeper in his life, not just who he's cheering for, in hockey this season, or, how his job's going, but begin to delve into the more important questions in life, and then share from my experience about what God has done. I think it's important that we begin with our experience but then we make people aware that what God has done in our life, He can do in their life, and in even more wonderful ways than He's done with us.
The respect thing, I think, is really important. I think that, anticipating that situation,
Yes.
the reaction being, well, you think there's something wrong with me?
Right.
You're telling me I need to change. And one of the great lines that Father Bob Bedard used for many years was, my renewal of faith, hasn't made me better than anyone else. It's made me better than I was,
Right.
but it hasn't made me better
Right.
than anyone else. So that respect thing is really key about building the relationship, setting that context, and as you said also earlier about that the evangelistic outreach is one of charity, is one of love. We're just extending love to people. So if love is what guides us, then it's part of what leads us to make sure that trust and that mutual respect is there. So
That's
good,
right.
very good answer. Thank you.
Wonderful.
That's solid. Well, I know there'll be many of our viewers are hearing this and saying, "Wow, I'd love to get this evangelization training." So,
Sure.
for those of you viewing us today, if you'd like to get more information on Mission of the Redeemer and their programs for training and evangelization, write to us at Food for Life, and we'll send more details to you. Michael, God bless the good work that you and your wife are doing
Wonderful.
in evangelization, and you've really answered the call to the lay apostolate that the church shouted at Vatican II, and so you're a real example. So we bless you today.
Thank you, Chris.
And thank you for joining us on Food for Life.
Great. It's a great joy to be with you.
Peace to you.
Thank you.
See you.